I'm really pleased to be invited, but also to have so much time, because normally I never have enough time, and I will surely run out of time again. I'm always running out of time. There's a lot to say about the projects I've been involved in over the years. It's sometimes hard to land it in the right way. So for today, I was just guessing what might be the best approach. And in the first part, I'll be presenting you what I would call the fundamental stance I've developed, right? It's transferable, so there might be a few too many fine art examples. It's my background. I have a first degree in philosophy, but I was always very engaged in photography. So this is kind of the back story of my philosophy was photography. And then I kind of followed on with a master in photography and a doctorate in photography, stumbling across the problem of why am I unhappy with philosophy and why am I unhappy with art education? There seems to be a gap between both, which for me personally, this idea of research really filled well. I've tried to explain this in various moments through the idea of sense. Either of the field has not enough sense for me. It has to be both. It has to be an engagement of the full body, my mind, my body, my perception, and I don't want to cut anything out, right? So this is the idea of how can we not only integrate ourselves, but also the context within which we operate. What is the strongest position we can have. So what happened was I did my defense and all this, right? And the last chapter of the doctorate was me trying to make sense of what is artistic research, right? And the examiners, an art historian and a practicing artist at the time, suggested it's a good piece. Well, I had to do a few corrections, but the last chapter could maybe be an appendix. It wasn't really seen as central to the argument, and I thought it was really disappointing, because for me, without the last chapter, without declaring what this is about, where it sits culturally, epistemically, and artistically, I felt it was not complete. Granted, it wasn't a great chapter, but for this audience, it didn't really matter what artistic research was. It mattered that there was some value in the various arguments that were made. But that's been the beginning of this journey for the Journal for Artistic Research, because I realized at this moment in the networks I was in that so many people were troubled by what it is, high interest in the field, high engagement in the concerns that can be raised, but very little to go by, very little definitions. Most people, even still today, after decades of this, when we receive submissions for the journal, are trying to orientate themselves and trying to find out where their stance in this field is. So this kind of moved into JAR as a almost experimental platform where we wanted to create inroads into how else we can do artistic research in a academic environment that isn't so much dominated by whatever scientists or what humanities research believe to be research we should be carrying out. The good thing for us is that we are, published by the Society for Artistic Research, which is a non-profit society. We are not following any particular government or legislation, what counts or doesn't count as research. We define it ourselves as we go along. We're working continuously on refining what this is. So in some sense, the members that publish us want us to push boundaries, to see what's possible. So for instance, when we started, there were virtually no journals around that were operating like us. Today, you can find a lot of journals to publish in, which are rich media for different fields in different ways. And also those kinds of media documentations in the context of doctorates have become possible. At the beginning, there was no online thesis possible, right, in many places. And now it becomes possible. So things have been moving. But on the ground, and this is kind of where I want to start the lecture, on the ground, we still struggle, I think, as a community with what constitutes text. And this is like the big issue, even for us, for the journal, that there is an understanding of text that is kind of culturally accepted, that the text looks like this. You know, there's like a page and there's words on that. And somehow when we publish, you know, we've got this idea in mind that text comes in this way, in this form, and we have to read text in this way. Now, as we know all about, and others have to critique text, whatever, but practically, what does it mean for us if we're expanding the notion of text, if we're engaging with text in ways that are, you know, allowing us to trace better, you know, artistic values, you know, within the articulations that we make. So that's kind of the fundamental mental point, that we as a journal would like to get rich, dense texts submitted, and we would like to get to the points where, you know, real artistic originality and value come in, and where the concerns, the artistic concerns, actually are dominating the argument, rather than some form of prepositional language that is codified in this particular form. However, if you're looking at published, right, in our field, such as this, or maybe as this, we see the text actually already is not necessarily just this block of text, words on a page. There are relationships created all the time between figures, images, or references, you know, where we interrupt the way we are reading. We read down and then we hop over, look at the image, and go back at the image. Sometimes, at least when I'm reading, I might get a sense of the argument just by looking at the picture. I kind of shortcut the text because I might be getting bored halfway through, but the image captures me and I continue reading. So already in very standard academic publishing, you know, what we're having is actually tensions between media and not necessarily a continuous linear reading of text. And this can be deployed artistically. For instance, if you compare this image where the figure is somehow at the margin, but kind of creeping into the text, right? And then you take this choice where the image is bigger, right? It kind of says, I'm not just on the margin, I'm kind of take over the text, I'm kind of sitting bang in the middle of this. Still black and white, still a figure, sort of plate, but text is interrupted differently. You can interrupt text differently. I mean, text has a sense of words on a page now. This idea that we read linearly, this idea that the argument is made in this one letter follows the other one, and this is how we compute meaning, you know, is already actually quite an idealization. The reality is we keep hopping between elements and going crisscrossing and getting a different sense of the page and a different sense of how the meaning is negotiated there. That's just an academic book, right, by an art historian, so I just picked one from my shelf. To illustrate this, and already you can see these devices. And then if I move to a different place in this book, you can take the image can take over, right? We're completely in a different space. We're not reading anymore. We're kind of seeing. And then suddenly, what happens in this book is that I'm on that page. I'm looking at this piece, documentation of a work by Ann Wilson, right? I turn over and I'm showing a detail. Now, this detail is bigger, I mean, wider than the full picture. So symbolically speaking for me, you know, I mean, this is a particular focus, right? I'm made to look differently here. I'm made to focus on a detail. I'm made to screen out text in a different way at this moment. And it's these devices, you know, that actually are standard, but we don't pay attention to the fact that this is already highly skilled design and rhetorics of meaning making within an illustrated book in some ways. But it needn't stop here in this particular example, because if I look at a page like this, which is also in the same book, you would say that, yeah, I just need two figures and they don't fit, so I kind of put them on a separate page. But the way I'm looking at this is that I'm kind of starting to compare. It's not compared in the text, so these two figures are just figures illustrating two points made in the text. But I look at this, you know, trying to look at a page opened up, in this case by Caspar David Friedrich, why they pick these ones, how they connect, what kind of landscape are we talking about here? You know, how is my eye guided between kind kind of these two images here. So it's a whole space, that happens not just between text and image, but between images, as we go through. And consciously or not by the author, I mean, there's a production process of books where designers and the publishers have a lot to say how the pages look like. But we get to places like this then where I don't even know how to read this, I mean, there's some text up there, but I think it's a highly stimulating page, right? But what specifically this page means visually, it's a different question, right? Now, I don't mind this personally. I kind of find suggestions and in a way, the openness of this page as to what I bring to it, how I'm going to read this page, rather productive, right? And yes, labels and titles are helping me to kind of focus in particular ways, but I can wander off. I don't have to follow what this image is supposed to say specifically for this kind of moment in the text. So a lot is established in academic publishing that we don't pay attention to normally because we have an idea of what text is supposed to be as a linear. The moment artists come into this area, right, things change quite dramatically because suddenly, this still kind of black and white and the page is set with these margins in particular ways, right, can become a whole playing field, for meaning making. So I'm just going to pick another book from my shelf. This is Hockney's Secret Knowledge. Now you open the book and it starts like this. I mean, the argument he's making is that from about 1430, I think, painting changed radically because optical devices were introduced. Big discussion at the time when he published this. I don't know if it's true or not, but in terms of the argument that's been made, right? You've got no doubt when you open the book that, this is what we're looking at, right? This kind of comparisons of two different ways of painting, of engaging, with figuration in the widest sense, right? So, where's the text? It's my question here. I mean, how am I reading when I'm opening this book? I mean, as you can see, that's called the dust checker, and then the first page is this. You can fold this open. So we're starting bang from the image is the text here. The image is the way they're curated, the way I put on the page. And it continues like this if you go through the book. So we have, no figures that would say, this is anchored in this sentence at this moment in the text. It's much freer, right? It's guiding us to read. And those texts, fragments, they are in a way summaries or maybe jumping off points or additional guidance of how to engage with this, and maybe moving to a conceptual level, offering certain words, or maybe the argument he's making. But first of all, in a way, we start to look closely from the get-go at what's happening here, and then we get these little nudges into particular ways of engaging with this. And that keeps continuing through the book in various ways. For example, here it's an experimental setting where Ingres' drawings are compared with his own studies with optical devices. Yes, we can explain and discuss this, but we can also simply try to work out, what are similarities and differences here in these experiments? Do we find moments where his argument about the history of art sticks, or do we disbelieve it? Is there evidence here or not, right? The whole idea is that what he believes to have happened in the history of art can be evidenced through close study of works and artistic experimentation and comparisons between the experiments and the source material. And you see how we in this case, for example, if you're looking at this page, how we are not really told, to compare how fabric is draped and operates across these pages, but it all really comes down to the point that he believes, and this is this is really how it ends the text then, because that is his, in a way, conceptual argument that optics provide the only practical means to be able to do this. So all of this kind of comes to this point, like there must have been optics involved. He doesn't believe it, he cannot show it not to be the case. Now, this is also, and importantly, I think, a communication device. So we can say, publishing is accounting for your epistemic achievements, right? But it's also a question of, are there people listening to this, and how are people listening to this, and how does it change the world that we have done these differences? Now, of course, Hockney is famous and he can afford things. So, but there is no real kind of need to stick to particular media. For example, another aspect of this project was a BBC documentary that he was in. So you can.
Studio, we pinned up hundreds of colour photocopies of paintings. Paintings which seemed to have an optical look and paintings that did not. Slowly, we got a kind of order. I put Northern Europe at the top and Southern Europe at the bottom. The wall was necessary because I could then sit back and scan centuries of Western painting. We worked back further and further, and finally we got to a date where beyond that it is very different. And that date is approximately 1420. That date is when a big change occurs. That's been observed by every art historian. The explanations for it are everybody could suddenly draw better. Really. Not that good an explanation, not that rational, really.
What I'm interested in here is the fact that in that clip, for example, in other elements, you can see that the film has different affordances here. So this wall of color photocopies or whatever it is, postcards they pick up, I don't think it would work in the book form in the same way. I mean, this is like crazy when you see it like this. I don't think, a big shot like this, on a page like that, would have the same effect. We are really, rhetorically put in a position where we just think, wow, I mean, what did he do, Like how did that work, And in a way, the seriousness and the investment taken and the way the eye is guided across this and, moving to the timeline when the moment happens, all devices, to re-emphasize, this particular shift he's talking about, right? And of course, there comes the, artist persona, like because he's an artist who knows about drawing, he has an authority to say, I don't believe that suddenly they can draw better. As I say, it's not so much at this moment about is he right or wrong. The point is that on what ground are we debating whether he's right or wrong? What is the evidence that's happening? And how is that, in a way, event of his publication being constructed in different media in different ways? Within the book, within exhibitions where he shows the different experiments, between the television program that was commissioned and so on. So it's a highly complicated event with references back and forth in particular ways, that allows us to engage and test whether we think he's correct or not, right? I wonder if the argument would have been equally disturbing to art history at the time had it been simply a paper in a journal, where Hockney says, I've discovered this, without actually, evidencing it so much. So the first point I want to make here is that just looking at these examples, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot that people have been doing. It's just that for some reason, the orthodox or canonical view on research publication is really, it has to be in this kind of form of text, humanities type, research, and not actually excessively media-driven, excessively going into these materials and creating a adequate complexity that that holds your argument, that holds, you know, what it is that your particular project is about. Just because I can't help myself sometimes, I've moved, when I prepared the lecture, into a bit more speculation areas, where I thought, if that is the case, right, and if I go into other types of publication, you know, would that model also hold? So, for example, I kind of looked at Sebald's Austerlitz book. That's a page from the book. Again, you know, we have, I mean, it's a novel, you know, so we have not an academic claim, but it is actually a highly researched, you know, very dense account of various layers of histories and being, you know, in the book. But it doesn't claim to be academic, of course. And my question is, if I'm reading this text closely, right? I can, of course, say I have text passages. I've got images, just like on the other page I've shown. But actually, if you read the text closely, what happens is certain text sections use different genres and styles. It's not like a single text genre he's using. There is experiences, telling of you know, what happens as the story progresses, but there's also moments of historical research where the floor plan is, for example, mentioned. And so if you start cutting this out, like I've tried here, you know, we start creating a different kind of relationship. So this is about a fort in Belgium that was used as a prison camp by the Nazis in Germany. And he's reading, in a way, in this image that's been given as text, not as image, right? So, but we're still working on a very strong visual side here. It says, but what I now saw before me was a low-built concrete mass rounded at all its outer edges and giving the gruesome impression of something hunched and misshapen. The broad back of a monster, I thought, risen from the Flemish soil like a whale from the deep. You know, so we don't have to have an image like this to have an image, right? You know, images can be in all sorts of ways. So this idea that this is text and this is image, for me, doesn't even count. I think we're moving between units of meaning in text all the time, and we can call them images if we want to. We can call them you know, certain local constellations of meaning, you know, that connect up across the pages, across the books, and across the other media we're using. And I'm interested in this, the fact that on a lower scale, on a lower level of meaning making, you know, we constantly do this, but we keep forgetting that we constantly do this, I find. At least that's what I do when I read. And I would just like to invite you, when you read a book, even philosophy, try to work out really how you're shifting in your engagement with the text. You know, whether you really read linearly, whether you really read also in the same tempo, like it's just scanning lines, or whether there are these blocks appearing and these hops you're making and how they're connected up. On the plane here, I thought I should have shown you a page from books I'm reading, which are completely, you know, scribbled into. Like, I mean, my books become, you know, navigational maps of text, because that's the way I can compute text, right? I think it's just something that people not pay attention to, and maybe people in the arts in particular, they kind of almost as this mode of reading is invalidated by some structures that are educationally put onto us, put it like this, you know, that's not allowed to do to a text, right? You can quote it, but you can't be doing this, you know, really. I find those pages really stimulating, you know, for me, and you know, it's a clear mode in which you're thinking this text through, right? And it can be done like this, you know. I can interpret this book in this way, I don't think, without any problems. And of course, we've got loads of examples. Tristram Shanley, Lawrence Stern, you know, where famously, it's very funny, you know, how drawings of how the narrative unfolds, and there's a black page at a later stage, you know, appear. So there's a lot actually of historical experiments with that form. And before we had this very kind of clear definition of what text on a page is. And then I thought about Nietzsche as well. Like, we know that Nietzsche is supposed to be ill, right? And he can't really sit for a long time, so he does these walks, and then he can memorize only certain sections. So you're going to get this aphoristic style, right? It's always described as, he couldn't sit and write. I mean, getting blind and being ill and whatever. But actually, maybe there is a semantic reason why the books are written like this, and not just a deficit to his ability of writing proper philosophy. And if you're looking at the particular, say, use and misuse of Nietzsche in the history as a proto-fascist, which he surely was in some respects, so it's no apology for this, but the moment his writing becomes text through his sister's publication of The Will to Power, it's a different book. It's not the book that Nietzsche published, because we start to see a linear argument emerging that was historically being abused later. So I'm trying to say that all these excuses that are being made for people who are not working the way we think text should be done, and in a way devaluing the particularities of how this text works, and apologizing in some ways. So my question a little bit is, what are the effects of this artistically? Or what can you make out of this artistically? I mean, where's the work here? Right? As you've seen of some of these images, you could say, right, the work is on the figure, right? I've taken a picture of a piece I made and it's here, or a recording of a performance, it's there, right? So the work is inside, but I'm suggesting there's a work also in here, right? And of course you could argue that the relationship between what's low scale inside the page and what's between pages and between works, films and books, exhibitions and performances, is such that maybe there's an intrinsic relationship between how your artworks organize themselves and how you organize your artworks and how you organize the thoughts that your readers have as they go through what you organized for them, right? So form, articulation form becomes to me, crucial to entering the fabric of the work on various levels, right? And having a journal, my entry point is this publishing thing, but you can look at this at various levels too. And in a way, at some point, and this is kind of, for me, an important argument, at some point, where this work starts becomes secondary, right? If your kind of publishing or articulation effort, in a way, becomes so intense and takes over, you could have any shot of any work there, really, because fundamentally, they just disappear in the background, right? What happens really is like, how are you making this stick across all of that? So here's an example which I've always found fascinating, which is Gabriel Orozco's fairly famous, exhibitional book, Photogravity. It's a catalog. It's a catalog for a show here in Philadelphia in 1999, with the only difference that, and I know this because I know the designer of this book. He talked to me about it. It's a big kind of Museum of Contemporary Art show in Philadelphia. The budget for the show, was the curator's budget. The budget for the catalog was the artist's budget. So the only way the artist could really engage with this big museum show was the catalog. From the catalog, you would have no idea what the show was like. I've been trying really hard to source the internet to work out, what was the show here, right? Because there's no clear identification in the book itself, as to how to imagine the site in the museum, how this worked. Now, this show traveled to California as well. So the only pictures I found, were from California of the same show that was shown in Philadelphia earlier. And I can show you these. I mean, that's what I could find out. So it's like these kind of cut-out shapes, with these stands, and you can walk around there. So let's imagine, that was the show in Philadelphia, right? The catalog looks like this. Some pages for you here. So you can imagine, like, there's cutout elements, right? We kind of get a sense of it's related, but it's also very differently related in terms of the relationships that it creates. But so if it's a catalog of the show, it's a transformation or transposition of what happens in the show in particular ways, right? For me, the important part is the show has disappeared. We don't reference the exhibition, we reference the catalog. The catalog is what survives, what allows us to relate to, what makes impact, what has made impact. The show has disappeared, right? So if you're thinking about investments, right, we've got a big budget of the gallery doing this show, and nothing wrong with it, right? But emphasizing what's surviving and in which way it's surviving, and in which way it will continue to influence artistic and cultural development, is a different thing. And the most famous example of this, of course, is this. As we know, Duchamp submits Fountain to an exhibition that's supposed to show everything. It's rejected. It never was a work on a plinth. He goes to Stieglitz, has it photographed and published in The Blind Man, his kind of magazine in New York at the time. We all think that this is an artwork, and you can kind of find it in museums of modern art now, but it never really was exhibited. It was lost as a work. All you see is replicas now that are shown in big plinths normally, not like that. The work is constituted at the moment it's being published. It never existed, but it's a massive reference in the history of art. I mean, this idea that the work only becomes a work if you're engaging with its publications and event structure. So I'm wondering, why we are not engaging, in this event in a much more enthusiastic and forceful way as artists. Why are we so timid when it comes to creating publishing events, right? Because of whatever frameworks there are that tell us, how to do this. One second. So this is the one point, in a way. Now, we could argue that this is like still a bit of a side avenue. It's like a specific problem for artistic researchers. But actually, there's a cultural shift, where this fits in. And let's just say for the moment, artistic research hasn't been invented because, some kind of reorganization of European higher education or funding structures or whatever. Maybe there are different currents underlying, that make this point in the 90s or maybe in the early 2000s, as a necessary culturally opening up to different forms of art making, right? Let's assume this. It's not institutional driven, it's actually art and creativity driven, right? We actually see that even in areas where you're not saying, oh, this is research, right? The same patterns of publishing actually appear. So it's not like something I'm saying is specific to this particular kind of community that we are. In fact, it's almost as if non-academic publishing initiatives are more experimental than academic publishing initiatives. And that's striking, where research should be leading somewhere, they're not always leading. And that's a strange situation. We should be in a different position. And it has a lot to do with, I would argue, that, as I've illustrated in these examples, the disciplinary structure that we're in, like where's visual art, where's bookmaking, where's video making and filmmaking and so on, where's performance, is not lending itself easily to shifting across and creating hybrid formats. And who is helping you to make a hybrid thing? Who's assessing a hybrid output? It's very hard. But within contemporary art institutions and contemporary culture, I think this is it's just a paradigm now. So I've got this example here from a museum exhibition from Italy. Like the exhibition space, is completely taken over by precisely this kind of hybridity, where artifacts are offset in particular ways, where I move between objects, texts, like design solutions that suggests overlaps in particular ways, mappings, in this case, it's about basically artifacts that the Italian state robbed from various countries they've occupied. So it's also a question of how do we think that history, this kind of history of colonialism, and how to make sense of a particular, call it, crisis of objects and the collection they have. So it's also an attempt of activating, an archive in ways that the curators believe meaningful for today. And this goes into the vitrines they commissioned for the museum itself, where some of these elements you saw on the wall, like these kind of frames, these line drawings that go around boxes or intersect boxes, are repeated on these kind of furniture, that's being used in the museum, and into events where they reflect on, in this case, exposure, how vitrines operate in an exhibition context within museums of anthropology. So there's an active engagement in all sorts of ways with, how is this material to be organized, and what do we do if you organize it, if you put it away in a vitrine, if you can't touch it, if you separate it by glass, and so on. So the wall, for example, it says, to exhibit is to show, but also to tell. An exposition is not only an exhibition, but also the placement in a context of a particular cultural situation today, where an artifact or artifacts from different places, from different times, become a meaningful constellation in today's cultural context, right? And we're assuming that we're taking a physical or symbolic risk at this moment of putting them together in particular ways. And again, I haven't got a picture of this. There's artists commissioned to engage with the exhibition, but also a publication, it's a journal type of magazine they publish, where it is almost like the kind of contextual apparatus that is not really referenced in the show, but it's full of leads, possible leads you can take if you want to kind of engage with this. So it's an engagement with and an extension of various themes that go, but it's no interpretation of the show. It doesn't say, this book tells you what the show was about. I was almost disappointed because I was wanting to have more about the show, but it was opening all these different ways of looking at this idea of exposure or exposition within the museum context. So that's an example. There's another example which is more recent, as recent as this. So I gotta have this name problem with this famous artist. I just for a moment slipped the name. Everybody knows. Anyway, I'm gonna play the video, and then I'm gonna tell you the name. Kentridge, of course. So this is what you might call a video essay, but it's like a complex, multi-part piece that I was trying hard to kind of get access to. It's on Mubi, apparently, so I had to subscribe to Mubi to kind of see this. Have a look at this.
74 circuits of the studio. You stopped to read your email. There was a cup of coffee. There was a hitching of the trousers and a blowing of the nose. A second cup of coffee undrunk. A reading of the news. There was a stop for 4 minutes, a kind of reverie. I have no idea what you were doing there. I made a note. Procrastination. Productive procrastination. One can think of the studio as a kind of enlarged head, in which, instead of an idea moving 3 centimeters from one part of the brain to another, one has the 5 meters, 7 meter, 9 meters, walk from one part of the studio to another. The circling of the studio is a ritual which involves a peripheral vision of seeing the drawings, the postcards, the newspaper headlines, all the different elements in the studio as you walk past. And together with this peripheral vision, there's a kind of peripheral thinking, allowing ideas to emerge that are at the edges of one's thinking. It needs the physical activity of taking a material, a piece of paper, a piece of charcoal, and through those enabling a new thought of the world to emerge.
I mean, a bit of an aside, but still kind of relevant. In this model I've proposed, where does the studio kind of stop? Where's the private and the public? In this case, when and how am I entering Kentridge's head, as he describes it? How has he externalized his head in the studio? How am I able to engage in the particular operations, that he's talking about? I personally saw the piece first in Venice, in this kind of slightly off space, where you had to kind of come to see the parts. But it was set up as the exhibition space or a studio space. So the space I saw at first wasn't on the couch at home. It was actually like this. And in a way, as I was watching him talking about his studio and walking along there, I saw that. I could imagine I'm in a studio, right? I'm studying in a studio something of the relationships and his engagement with histories and visual materials in particular ways. And through the films, 6-part film, it was unfolding temporally such a way that each part would emphasize a particular constellation co-present in the overlaying relationships within that space. Again, far too much to talk about here, but just to give an idea that the level of thinking, rethinking, engaging on various levels, it's really high in these kinds of works that we're constantly, dealing with. Much later, then, it also went into a book publication. So I had to kind of pre-order the book at some point to get it, right? The dust cover is a poster, really. Dust sheet, if you kind of unfold it, it looks like this. And what we just saw in the video is actually, and that's slightly disappointing to me in the book, because other than the exhibition catalog I showed you earlier, Kentridge doesn't use the book a lot to add additional materials. It's a reconstellation of quite the same materials, and I thought that was a bit strange that it becomes a bit more like a coffee table book, a book that allows me to remember, but not necessarily on all these layers, to rethink the format and to rethink that engagement. So that I'm a little bit critical. At the same time, it's really well produced, and it does the job in case you have missed or maybe just need another access route to whatever this project worked on. So here's how it looked, or looks in the book. So there are these shots that are taken as photographs. Emphasis on this diagram that you saw at the back of the studio wall. The dialogue between him as one and him as two is being kind of printed here, so you can kind of read and reference it properly if you wanted to. I think it's important that we've got two sides here. So the diagram on the one and this kind of image of the tree, which both appear in different places in the exhibition on the two sides of the sheet. And of course, this in this section, the emphasis on the studio, like how does this look? How might this look? Like for me, the question is this the studio? Because for me it's a stage set, right? Is that the real studio? I haven't seen Kentridge's studio myself. I've got no idea, right? I know he's rich, and I know he's got loads of people working for him. Is this the real thinking space, right? Or is this what I'm made to think is the thinking space? He might have a completely different thing going on in his place. Does it matter, and how does it matter if it weren't, right? It's a bit like what I told with Hockney, just different in this case. Hockney tries to make this art historical argument like a big thing in academic circles. Here is much more like how does he declare himself as an artist, and how does he say his mode of working and thinking operates, and what do we need to kind of get into him, so to speak. And this peripheral thinking that he was talking about, this circling and the materiality of this and the reworking, and at the bottom it says the world is invited into the studio. It comes in the forms of images that are stuck on the wall, newspaper headlines, and so on. So this invitation into this space, that the articulation he's assembled, this event is an invitation of a particular way to enter a particular mode of working and thinking. It's still a little bit, if you take this example, as if Hockney, but also Kentridge, the big declarations almost, like it's a monumental thing, right? My question is, on what kind of, in a way, level does this work? So I feel, me personally, you might feel differently about this, I feel a little bit hit by these examples. So these things are hitting me in a not a good way. I mean, they're working, don't get me wrong, but kind of the artist persona, this kind of awe I'm supposed to have when I'm engaging with this intense investment, through capital and through other people and networks. And I mean, Hockney didn't put this all up by himself. He stands in front of it. Kentridge didn't produce it by himself like this, right? It's a massive team effort, right? That disappears, at this moment. And I can't help thinking there's an element of, in a way, art stylization in that message that I personally don't like within non-academic publishing, right? It's a celebration of a certain form of art that you can see as problematic. But it needn't be like this. So my next example is where I'm hit on a very different level, right? I'm not really hit by, in a way, emphasizing how great this artist is, but actually from the fabrics and the materiality of a certain constellation that, in this case, Straub and Huillet have created for us.
Je n'entre presque jamais dans la salle des primitifs, ce n'est pas de la peinture, pour moi, que voulez-vous que me fasse? Les maladresses de Cimabue et les naïvetés de l'Angelico et même les perspectives d'Uccello. Il n'y a pas de chair sur ces idées. Tenez, regardez-moi ça. C'est une idée, c'est tout un peuple. Un moment héroïque dans la vie d'un peuple, mais les étoffes collent, les ailes battent, les seins se gonflent. Je n'ai pas besoin de voir la tête pour imaginer le regard, parce que tout le sang qui fouette, circule, chante dans les jambes, les hanches, tout le corps. Il a passé en torrent dans le cerveau, il est monté au cœur. Il est en mouvement. Il est le mouvement de toute la femme, de toute la statue, de toute la Grèce.
So I don't speak French really. Can't pretend to understand all the words. I mean, some I do, right? But I mean that voice, that way of moving, that shot, and the kind of blurredness that comes. I mean, and a text that's just available. So the text Beckers gave us there already. An interpretation of how to see work in the Louvre, how to suggest meaning. I would imagine I would have walked past this. I mean, I might not, no idea, but it looks like it's somewhere in the staircasey area, you know. With this in mind, you know, there's no way I can walk past this, right? And it's creating relationships. It suggests historical relationships, you know, and energies, you know, that crossing at particular places, you know, that for me hit on a very different level here than any, you know, particular art historical or otherwise historical kind of reference. And I don't have here the sense of somebody pushes themselves in the foreground. You know, for me, what's exciting is that yeah, it might be poetic, it might be speculative, you know, but you know, it's really engaging with the works and with their presence and with what possibilities they afford in specific contexts, both institutionally and historically for us today, or it's a bit older, but still, you know. So in some ways, this kind of meaning communication or articulation, you know, is possible. It's outside of some of the registers, you know, I started with, but this is where I feel it becomes, you know, moving and effective, you know, artistically in this specific form that the filmmakers have chosen here. And it has, I mean, that's why I call it video essay. I mean, again, in a hybrid kind of situation between a text spoken and a temporal unfolding of, you know, various kind of shots and relations, right? But you know, this you can also trace, you know, in a live setting. I mean, you don't have to do this in a documentary format necessarily. This is not only about, you know, are we doing this in a book, are we doing this in a film, are we doing it, yeah? But actually, I find lecture performance format equally important. You can find a lot about artist books. You can find a lot about video essay literature. There's very, very little on lecture performance. It's such an important, you find loads on YouTube. I mean, if you want to follow lecture performance, right? There's loads of examples, but a study on lecture performance as a form, right, I don't think exists. I mean, if you have one, please tell me. But it's not really worked on a lot, but it's super important for us, you know. So I'm not affiliated in a particular way, but when I'm in a teaching situation, right, it's virtually unheard of that audiences would refer to the form of the lecture. They refer to the content of the lecture in the question sessions, right? How did you make this argument is less important in our context often than what did you say, and do I have another reference that I can kind of tell you, or maybe a question I have, you know. So what I just said in terms of books and videos applies to those moments when you have to give your presentation and your projects, you know. How do you structure this performance? Like this example, of course, during COVID, and so it's difficult to reference a live performance in a non-mediated way. So I'm kind of just picking this as an example. What Laurie Anderson has chosen here.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thanks so much for tuning in this evening. I'm pretty sure that the Norton Committee at Harvard made an enormous mistake when they asked me to do this lecture series. And it was really my own sense of the absurd that made me want to say yes. So in that spirit, I'll begin. But you know, once, right before I was going to do a concert, I was on stage testing a couple of cables just last minute, and the promoter of the festival came on stage and he said to me, "Is Lonnie here? I'm so excited to meet her. I'm such a Lonnie fan." And I suddenly realized that he thought that he'd booked Lonnie Anderson. And I should have said, "No, I'm Laurie Anderson. There's been a misunderstanding. I'm doing the show tonight, and it's called Stories from the Nerve Bible, and it's, you know, stories and violin." And ideas and electronic music, but his eyes were glazing over, and I didn't want to disappoint him. So I said, wait right here. I think she might be out in her trailer. I'll go check in the trailer. I'll be right back. Lonnie was not in her trailer. There was no trailer. No trailer at all. And so I just hid out for a while and hoped the whole thing would just blow over. Do you know what I mean? What war is this? What time is it?
I just realized, because I spoke about this earlier, if you pay attention to the genres and the modes she's using as we go through it, how we captured at various moments of this opening kind of sequence of this lecture. So there's a lot possible, right? And a lot of kind of movements you can create through the way that you're staging, whatever it is you're presenting. And in a way, the shift of media, she's kind of speaking through an avatar, she's kind of creating a sonic environment with voice or without voice, it becomes atmospheric, intensifying in particular ways when you need it to, and she does this really well. And I realize I'm running late, this is like crazy. Whatever I do, I'm always out of time. But I want to show you the last example of these because, again, it's just to suggest to you what's happening, right, or what has been happening, and how it works and how convincing it is. So here's this final kind of contextual example of a Leckie lecture performance, Cinema in the Round. Again, of course, you have to find materials, but here, again, you might have seen, I didn't go to see the lecture performance, but of course the film becomes the event really for people like myself and you, who might not have seen the lecture performance like myself, would know about this, right? And again, look out for the devices, where not just the shots, so how we're moving from a documentary format of the lecture performance to with the video essay format, and how the voice shifts, whether it's a voiceover recording or direct recording, right? So we're moving between these spaces in that. So in this case, the live lecture, is a very important index, for him in the video production, right?
I'm beginning this chapter with the paintings of Philip Guston because they are meat and they are potatoes. They're down to earth and they're a bit ham-fisted. They are dumb and they are dumberer. They're thick as a brick and a bit pudding-headed. But most of all, they are mental and they are matter. They are both images and things. So they are hunks and they are lumps. They are dunce and they are dents. And they are thunk and they are stuff. They're thunken stuff. And as paintings that feel like sculptures, or as the Campbell's advert said back then, they are soup that eats like a meal. So how can something that is as basically flat and two-dimensional as a painting and as Mickey Mouse as these crude images muster something so physical and so weighty?
And likewise, I would say, how can something like this lecture performance that is so Mickey Mouse be so weighty, right? It's a similar thing, right? You see how this operates. So moving into JAR now, into kind of this field again, and of course, I don't know, time. This kind of next example is, how would you kind of think through this in this kind of more academic research context, in particular in this case, when you're looking at music performance, when you have to rethink what the work is and what your work is in relation to this. So Paulo de Assis has submitted this one chapter of a larger kind of exposition to JAR, and I just want to show you this this little clip from that, which discusses how works already, disintegrate or can be seen as disintegrating into things, constellations of things. Listen to that.
So one of the fundamental ideas behind the project Music Experiment 21 has to do with the fact that we do not consider any given work as being completely and totally expressed in the score, or what we consider to be the last will of the composer recorded in relation to the piece, but we see any musical work as a complex conglomerate of very many things, very many objects that emerge throughout the history of such a work, starting from the first sketches by the composer, going through the different editions over time, different recordings over time, and also different theoretical reflections about the work, about transcriptions of the work. We think that all those different elements, these different things, they all contribute in different ways, but they all contribute to the way we know what we know about a given work.
So I'm not a musician. I've got no real idea how this works. I mean, I've witnessed, a number of examples. But if you take, say, a performer situation, studying the score, studying editions, studying YouTube recordings of people playing, a particular, piece in particular ways, we know that certain performances have changed the status of a work radically because nobody heard it like that ever before, and you cannot unhear this way of playing it, right? Now, we may not speak about, what happens at the moment you're performing in this way in terms of the references, right? I mean, a specialist might kind of realize this, me or the general audience might not, but it's a simplification to believe that all these references and experience are not crossing right at that moment you make this performance, and that your performance will not become elements of other crossings that are going to happen. It becomes a thing the moment it's being carried out. It becomes part of a constellation, of how a work stays alive and continues to stay alive and become meaningful, and how you connect up, historical situations with future situations, through a particular way of playing. And it's the same model, that's kind of what I'm suggesting here, of actually the materials we're engaging with are distributed. They are, happening in very dense relational ways, which we are reading and reconfiguring and restaging in ways that turn what we think exists. Right? Now, this is the one I'm out of time kind of thing, because I have a lot to say still. So I've got 20 minutes or something, which I'm not quite sure how to do. So I could show you, that's the plan, some stuff from JAR. Now, I would like to drop this, because otherwise I can do the rest. But we can also do this, and then but in a way, what I would show is not dissimilar. You put text and images and videos on a page, and you kind of create an assemblage or constellation, or what we call exposition, that has these effects of emergent original contributions, within whatever field you're working with. I would like to talk about this really later in terms of the practicalities of this. This lecture was more meant as a primer, why this is so exciting. So if you don't mind, I would not show examples now and talk a little bit more about the principal structures of this. If you mind, raise your hand and I shall obey. Maybe, no. So I'm sorry, it's like typical. But at the same time, what I'm hoping has happened is that you entered a space, giving time, that media space, that I presented, to actually see how intense and how dense and how connective, contemporary art working is, right? But let me spend the last 20 minutes on the principal layers. Of course, I could again go much deeper in this, but there's a lot of implications that come out of the model I've presented, right? The first implication is this, that there is no real separation possible between a creative act, so you do your work and then you publish it, and you make a discursive act, they are already from the get-go intertwined, is even if you do a work or practice a piece, right, and you go onto the stage, you're doing it with the public in mind. It's already playing on you where this will be, right? But as we've seen, and we've published quite a few examples also from music performers, the performance history, keeps changing you and the way you're going to play the next piece. You're not going to be it's not produced and done. It keeps being produced. It keeps unrolling an event at this moment. And what I find interesting is that all these elements that create this actually realize some of the potentials that are worked out in your materials, right? And also project the future, like, these things are still possible, right? It's not exhausted in any of these moments. So engaging with your project or your work in a way where you productively engage, artistically productively engage with publication as a means of realizing your research work, rather than thinking you realize it and then you publish it. We are getting far too many submissions where people don't engage with publication as an articulation and a making of something. It's like after the fact, this is it, I've done it and I'm writing it up now. And it's not engaging. It's not made for this platform, like an uploaded PDF or a video documentation of an exhibition, that shows the space, how great it is, but doesn't really zoom into what this is about, why it's relevant. A particular public, needs to engage in particular ways, with whatever it is you're putting forward. And a journal article online is a specific venue, reuse of something may well not work in this context. So one of the points I would make is that although you're going to run out of time in your project anyway, but from the get-go, actually, publishing is at the beginning of a project. It's not at the end of a project. It's always at the core, I would argue. And if it's too late, you're going to miss data generation. You're going to miss reflective work. You're going to miss the opportunity that testing constellation in a public context, produces understanding backwards and potentials forward. It's a very, very important site, often neglected, I would say. Second point is quite important for us and for me. I said earlier, where's the work, right? And I would also say, where's the practice? Where is artistic practice? How would I know this is artistic practice? Now, my position would be that there is no preconception of what it might be that's at the core of this. I'm completely open. Anything could be considered, as far as I'm concerned, this original practice. Art has well established itself as being not policed at its borders by somebody who knows what art is, right? It's going to be embodying itself in the way its works are inscribed in social and creative context, right? And then we kind of say, oh, that's art now. Duchamp wasn't art at the time, now it is, right? It's not identifiable. We shouldn't really go around thinking, pre-identifiable, put it like this. We shouldn't go around thinking, oh, I'm not doing this because it might not be art. It'll turn out whether it's part of it or not, right? But I don't think we know. And we as a journal shouldn't really think, we're not publishing this because it's not art, does it utilize, in a way, artistic resources in making itself emergent as such? And in some ways, you can have a great practice, but you may not, when you show the work, actually engage your practice at the moment of making a publication. It becomes about it rather than an extension of it. So there's a layer of documentation of some form of data generation, right? Through which I will know about what it is you're doing. And that is quite striking on a larger cultural context as well. If you're looking at how science has developed over the last decades, really, data, is massively important in empirical experimental science, in material science, right? Data is massively important. Open science policies, repositories, you get a massive data engagement. We are lucky to get a JPEG, next to a text, 100 kilobytes of data. That's the data. We're data sparse often. There's a rich field of data work, and I'm not meaning only data, computer data, but also what do you give people in an exhibition or performance context? How much data do they get to engage, right? It needn't be so sparse, right? So somehow, at some point, the work lives in and through the data on top of all other things, right? So engaging in data production and data curation and relation, I would say, is an important part to realize the potentials of the work. And for us then, at some point, the documentary format, one could argue, it's, exposes how that practice is to be seen as research. How does this practice make a knowledge claim or an epistemic claim? So you could say that exposition for us, is that in this particular constellation, maybe not in the performance, maybe not in the show, but in the journal article, right? I'm gonna motivate and engage my materials in such a way that a reader will have a knowledge gain, some transfer of knowledge. You could say that an artistic idea, is transformed at that moment into an epistemic claim. Some form of epistemic standing, that makes a difference in what we think we know. So in some sense, when you do this, as I've described earlier, we will always reconsider in various layers what the practice actually is. What is the person's practice through these layers will change as I go up and down in these. I may be a painter if I'm just showing a picture or pictures of 10 canvases, right? I become a researcher the moment I make these paintings stick as a knowledge contribution. Something else, something happens, along this. Somehow we have to target this. So we're reviewing this, we're kind of discussing it. How can we strengthen the knowledge effects of these particular submissions and constellations that we are receiving? Now, when I say data, a lot of people are not interested in data. I'm kind of a little bit of a nerd in some ways. I'm not a geek, but there's a trajectory within contemporary culture that we shouldn't neglect. So I spoke about and I showed you examples of exhibitions or performances or video essays or whatever, like how this happens artistically. But actually there's a way of reading culture over these decades in terms of information technology and developments within these fields. And I'm finding this quite exciting that you could argue, without us having realized this in the same way, that maybe artistic research has a particular contribution to make to our understanding what information is today, what data actually is today. And if I had time, which I won't have, I have a lot to say about that too. But in some ways, you could see AI technologies as a threat or a challenge because they kind of replace some creative processes. But actually, there's also a layer where they're very similar, where knowledge isn't anymore just committed to a series of bits and bytes, in a memory, but distributed in a highly interrelated mesh of neurons, right? With open-ended possible responses to prompts that you're having. Like when you go into a gallery space, you prompt that space and you get something back. That the work itself has not foreclosed yet. So there are structures which I find really exciting. Anyway, different topic, but we can look at a very different trajectory, which I wanted to propose in the last minutes, of information. Academic publishing is also information generation, and it's also reference generation, and it's also informing people, right? I mean, I'm publishing to inform. So how do I inform? What is information at this moment? And what can I demand of my channels of information to do to inform, right? Now, this is just one discussion that Claire Bishop had about information overload. She's a bit cynical, I would say, having grown up, in the UK as she has. She's teaching in the States now, but it's I think it's very interesting coming from this kind of more curation or critical kind of theory perspective, that for her, and in this kind of context, artistic research, the way artistic research has impacted on exhibition making and, in a way, information processing within material sides of art, is quite striking. This is difficult to read now, and I will not read through this, but just to highlight, changes in art education have arguably been a more decisive influence than any of the art historical forebearers that she's citing. The reason why exhibitions look like it today, so the argument, I find it difficult to believe, but that's a different point, that somewhere the reconfiguration of how we teach and learn and reproduce art in this context, has had, in her opinion, a massive impact on what people present today in exhibitions. There's a lot of discussion about, these kind of flat tables and spaces, things aren't hanging anymore, they're kind of like this, that we read in this way, and producing an overload situation that people actually are failing to engage in her opinion, because you're given all the data, but there's nothing happening with the data, and you're at sea with that. And the reason is, just the bottom part, that institutions expect it to be supplemented by something. So here's a supplement, in the Biennale, you've got all these tables and things, right? Which for her is a problem. Some of the key points that are raised in this text that I think we should look critically at whether or not we believe the reasons for the contemporary situation to lie in art education. As I say, I doubt it. But the first point is research-based installation art, or artistic research, you might say, cannot be understood in isolation from contemporary developments in digital technology. So we might feel, I'm not using the computer or whatever, but what I've tried to describe as cultural shift, the way we've moved from a linear to a distributed kind of organization of materials and cultures, happens on various levels, including computers, but not limited to computers. So technologies of exteriorizing materials, right? Such as writing and reading, such as filing, such as editing, whatever it is we do, is engaging technologies, and the affordances of technologies, changes what becomes possible in the artistic space. And they point to a distributed mode of knowledge. I just reference this at various moments. The shift is really from a memory put down at a particular point. This is the work. This is it, right? To something that happens across stuff that relates things. That's how knowledge is held in this model, and that produces a decisive reorganization of artistic forms. So artistic forms have changed for decades now. It can, or it does, produce an excess of information that is difficult to grasp. So in our situation, apart from producing data, right, so engaging with information, it's also how is that information being read, meaningfully read? I mean, presenting it is one thing, but making it legible is another thing. I mean, that's where the exposition kind of format comes in, that it needs the data, the distribution to work. But if it's just distributing, you've got an overload here, because as if it's self-explanatory, as if it by itself makes these connections, it needs activation by an audience that, you know, starts reading and connecting stuff up that is put up in a way that it can be openly engaged with and not with a fixed and closed meaning, right? You have words like skimming. So if we're failing, we are not looking anymore properly. We're just kind of skimming over things. So exhibitions become, you know, I was there, but I didn't really do anything there. Or I can sample. I can spend some time on this kind of box, on this piece, but the rest, you know, like I can't watch a video for 10 hours or 20 videos for 10 hours, you know, and so on. So how do we manage this? And what responsibility might you have as an artist to allow a depth without, you know, overburdening your audiences or losing their ability to find in all this kind of stuff what really matters to you? Right? So in the strongest examples of research-based art, the viewer is offered a signal rather than noise. Again, I'm doubting this kind of noise kind of thing, but if we talk about a signal, you know, some form of coherence, you know, that is suggested as an entry point or as a crossing of meanings, you know, that kind of allows you to engage and not start from being lost and having to make all the work yourself, right? Mark Leckey, she quotes, says, therefore, research has to go through a body, it has to be lived in some sense, transformed into some sort of lived experience, and so on. The richest possibilities for research-based installation emerge when pre-existing information is not simply cut and pasted, aggregated, dropped, put in a journal article, you know, but metabolized, you know, and I would say becomes legible in particular ways. In our case, you know, as knowledge contribution. Oh God. Yeah. Okay, so similar argument here. I'm out of time, as a newer will be. I'm just gonna focus on this part, which I mentioned earlier, but the effect really is hybridization. So these kind of singular and simple forms, you know, seem to produce resources, but they don't seem to be able to contain those kind of crossings I spoke about. The way things move between and across media and forms and readdress what it is they are. Again, coming from a information kind of technology side. Which brings me to the point of articulation. So this is kind of where I'm at right now in my own research or sense making is, you know, what has to happen really is, something must articulate itself at this particular moment at which it's being put together. So I'm interested in what articulation might mean for us. And I might have to end on this because later we can talk about other things, but that for me is at the moment the most crucial part. On the one hand, when we say articulation in English, I'm not a native speaker, so I had to learn this myself. You know, I articulate, I speak, or I utter. You know, but also in English, if you have an articulated lorry or a body is articulated, you've got joints. You know, so a trailer and a cabin, you know, are put together. You know, and that's an articulated lorry. So this joint, this flexible coming together of two static parts that have movement, spiel, or can play, right, is part of this. So when I talk about relations, right, they're not fixed relations, they are playful relations that two entities make. And not everything articulates with everything, which means that this trailer doesn't fit to that lorry. It doesn't articulate. It won't become an articulated lorry. It has to find a connection that materially works. Yeah? So we can't force articulation on materials. And this kind of means that we can redefine what a fragment is. So if the lorry example, or two versions of a score, are seen as fragments, of course we can argue that there is the work, the kind of the ideal object, that's broken into all these pieces, and I can kind of put it together. In a way, I would suggest that while it may be a fragment that articulates, it is actually already, in a way, limited in what it can be by the final form from which it's broken off. But if you look at fragment in a much more radical sense, that a fragment is a thing that needs another thing to articulate, but the wholeness, the kind of emergent new thing, is not preconceived. So two pieces come together that will not form a vase, but they will still articulate. We will not have an image of that ideal object before it articulates, before it comes together in something that suggests this, right? And we could argue that in the 19th century, early Romanticism, has had a strong appetite for radical fragmentation, and the late Romantic closure of the fragments into works, took away some of the radical spirit, that we've seen within that, at least within philosophy and literature. I'm not quite sure about music to be discussed, but I'm finding this really exciting how, on an open systems perspective, we have fragments, but we don't have a whole. It's not there. When it articulates, it has another unit above itself, so to speak, but it's again a fragment of something else that needs to articulate and so on. Quickly, so these links between things are not necessary. They're not. It's not puzzle pieces that belong together just like this. They have to come together, but different things can come together in different ways if they articulate, right? It looks like they were meant for each other all the time, but that's just a retrospective kind of feeling at this moment. So this openness, the fact that I'm entering this space, I'm sitting in a performance, the work might articulate with me, or it might not be. It's not necessary it will, but it might, right? My body might articulate. This openness, and in a way openness for articulation with an audience, for articulation with their lived experience, or with other works in their mind they bring to the space as they're hearing you play, would be an implication of this. So the making and the breaking of articulation is part of this. So there's no fixture in any of the examples I've given. It's like it stays like this, but I'm breaking this apart again. I'm recombining it here. Is this ability to try out how things articulate and how they add to all the potentials and possibilities the materials have is crucial. So encoding and decoding. As Howell says, infinite multiplicity of codings. And that's what I said earlier, and it's quite important, we don't know yet, before doing it, what will articulate with what. We have to, without doing, there's no recipe of saying, these two things, actually, they're going to make the difference. It's contingent and anti-reductionist thinking. I will leave out the last slide because I'm 5 minutes over. I'm very sorry. It happens to me. Whatever amount of time you give to me, I will overrun. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you didn't think it was too much. Thank you.
Maybe I would like to start by asking, do you see the differences between, in terms of publishing, between different fields of art. Because when we, let's say, use such instruments like diagramming or mapping, it's of course more relevant for visual arts. And for it might be less relevant for the dancers, let's say, and choreographers. So it's more about documentation, but also about publishing. Can we establish general, not standards, but general criteria or principles for various fields of art?
In music, you have a specific disciplinary context. So musicology and music theory occupy places within the knowledge field of music. There seems to be a strong separation and, in a way, discipline as a normative structure, built into this. And I, without knowing enough about it, but I just like to think that music researchers coming to us escaping the setting that historically is given to them, that they have to be somewhere, where the musicologist has to tell the meaning of the music. It can't be the musician, right? It has to come from this angle, right? And the theory is codified in particular ways. So, and often, as I was trying to say, often the media elements, so some aesthetic or experiential parts, but also, in a way, the subjectivity of the musician seems to be stripped out somewhere in this process. In particular, if you're moving to music theory and composition and whatever, where it becomes quite abstracted in a way. So it's a bit like I described it, that this rich media, but also the kind of trans or interdisciplinary setting, that artistic research affords, seems to be a bit of a respite at this moment. I can't really say for choreography, to be honest. We just published a piece in the last issue where, but also I know it from other debates, where choreography could have, a very extended application in the area, and some people do it. I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but it looks as if what I describe as exposing practice research or staging could be also choreographing or curating or whatever word you pick, where actually some of the kind of developed artistic forms within works, become leading when it comes to how do you conceptualize the space you're operating inside publication activities. So what is the choreography of a research event? And how is that different? And people are working with this. And what's the reach also? Because then you've got, for example, a different relation to body, to space, to time. If you're thinking about this beyond the classical kind of limited application of choreography in this. And that seems to be happening. So again, stepping out of more narrow disciplinary definitions and using what you can to make your case outside of these and circumventing, in a way, the normation, that would come in. And to me, media use, hybridity. So in this particular case, for this submission, it also looks like conceptual art or post-conceptual art in some ways. It's a post-media. It's clearly choreography. That's what they say. But formally, I couldn't tell. It does. But that's the point, I think. It's not recognizable automatically. Like this. But because that is different within the different fields, I don't think there's a specific or general kind of rules to take out of this, or even that the historical moment within different disciplines may be different, as we know in the past. So postmodernism in fine art wasn't at the same time, and different to postmodernism in architecture was different. Romanticism also very different, So I'm actually not even sure if the arts are operating, always or even fundamentally in as yet comparable historical registers. There may be differences. And my question would be, what are we learning from each other under these conditions where we're not saying that, say, in artistic research, fine art might be leading or whatever, because the conceptual artists kind of have done that, where you could argue, and I'm finding this really convincing, that something's also been maybe forgotten or maybe not valued sufficiently as compared to other disciplines who have a more intense relation to resources and skill sets that are needed for those disciplines today, right? So earlier when somebody else was here before the talk, I talked about notion of practicing, fine artists don't practice. They have a practice, but they're not practicing the way a musician practices or a dancer practices, right? And the resources you build up are fundamental and necessary to do certain things, right? And if we are only looking at, the kind of surface effects, if we don't have these kind of deep engagements with these resources that the disciplines hold, care, and further develop, right? The embodied and material dimensions of the work will disappear. So I'm quite concerned that, and this happens in science as well. So, for example, less funding for chemistry labs, or less funding for studio spaces, computer hot swapping desks, right? So you don't have this time to work in an expensive setting. You think you can shortcut it through desk work, kind of thing, right? So there's a general kind of tendency that this could be replaced. I doubt it can be, but the pressure will be there. So how do we demand or force, materiality and the kind of deep engagement with those things in all conditions, including the digital, but also off digital. So, and how can this case be made that, we need to continue investing in skills and resource formation, right? So you might feel in research, say, that maybe that's a part that is not sufficiently supported. So, for example, when I did my doctorate, master students had studio spaces. Research student didn't have a studio space as such. We were supposed to be somewhere else. We weren't in a creative studio setting, or like a shared communal, but not in the way that Kentridge talked about. A studio that is a thinking space that you kind of arrange and work in, not provided. Master students, yes. Doctoral students, no. It's not been valued in the same way. Too expensive, basically. Space is scarce, These people, they do desk work, right? And I would also say maybe media needs. So what kind of skills do you need in terms of data production, as I suggested? So, for instance, I did not think when we started that, in a way, video was such a crisis that there was no video before our kind of journals. I thought, people would need all sorts of tools like interactive coding and, I have all these ideas. Video, time-based formats, is the backbone of a lot that's happening. But, being good at this, or getting support or help, or just resources to pay for people working with you on how to edit and record and edit, a convincing video is actually it's a different set, right? Of skills that you need, and also harder to make yourself, because if you're performing, you need people helping you to record in a way. So it can become complicated in different disciplines, differently complicated. If I'm a painter, right, I can, take pictures after I've done my painting maybe, or do other things, right? If I'm working embodied, it's very different, different apparatus to kind of more expensive, more laborious, and different skill sets. I was lucky in some of the projects I did where we just had really good cinematographers to work with us to actually kind of distill in video or kind of touch upon some of the moments where we needed, time-based media. I'm going to try to grab a chair maybe because I feel slightly, I won't be standing for an hour.
So thank you for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for coming, and thanks Ramona and Bojana for organizing this event and getting an opportunity for us to participate here. I have a question for you. Could you expand your idea about necessity to share, of sharing and publishing your process before you get to the results? If I got it right in your lecture, because in like a researcher, I'm always face my self-doubts about what I can tell without the final result. And is it worthy to share the result? And it also related with some vulnerability we probably all have, because we don't trust our thoughts before we got the results. So could you expand your idea?
In your case, what's the result?
My result?
Yeah.
New knowledge.
No. So as long as you don't have new knowledge, okay. I was wondering whether say a performance or whatever might be a result. So when you say new knowledge, it's quite specific, because the reason why I'm more open there is that if we're assuming, there's a transformation step necessary, kind of all this messy stuff, at some point it becomes knowledge, right? The result may already be, ingrained, but in a way to think that this can be a result, being ready to take it as a result is a different mindset. So I think we are trained to see, results at the end of a linear process. Do all this and then there's the result. Result is at the end, and the question is whether this is the case. So it's a bit like digression, but it's very very important for me to say this. That when you accept it normally to a doctoral program, right? The moment of acceptance seems to be more important than the moment of completion. I mean, anybody can virtually complete it, but being accepted is a very different thing. To me, the acceptance is the first result. It's not seen as such because everybody believes, there has to be value in having gone through this, education, which there is. I'm not doubting this, but there is something of the promise, of the potential, of the excitement that comes at the application stage, right? That for me very often has a strong result character. I mean, and also, anyway. So just to say that there are ways in which to frame different stages, as results in different ways. We're just not used to that. And the question is whether a result is a full stop. So you've done this, and then there's the result, and then you finish it, or you're seeing that actually that's a result that leads somewhere else. So another thing, which I found always problematic. So it took me 3 degrees to actually survive professionally. So all these degrees, I just produced results. So I made dissertations and theses and whatever, but that's not what carries you. What carries me is actually what happens after the result. So how do I prepare after result before I got the result? I mean, that makes me survive, right? the result itself is a transition phase, in a very different process. And I didn't realize this, like I do my degree, I finish the thing, and then the next day I'm out of university, no resources, and nothing's happening. Nobody cares about your doctorate after it's done. I mean, it completely disappears, right? So if that is the result, I mean, I've got virtually no reference to my dissertation. It's like, it really disappears. It looks serious to you as your result, but this isn't where it happens. This result isn't the result. So there's a misunderstanding, I think, I mean, not that we don't have to, I don't want to say it's not a result in a certain sense, but professionally speaking, it has not got the same relevance that you think it has from a maker's perspective. And all these things come together to make me think that if you're clever, or if I had to learn to be clever, to look at a very different relation to kind of value generation, to kind of entry and exit points to processes that are interconnected in different ways, that make me survive in particular ways, right? And that make me feel excited by what I do, right? So this narrative, this kind of linear narrative that is inscribed as a project proposal in the result generation, is also a certain type of instrumentality, that may not be quite the same for the arts as compared to an industrial production process where you put this into the machine and this comes out and that's the result, right? You're going to sell this commodity. It doesn't seem to apply in the same way either. So that the departure points for results or products, can be anywhere along this chain. It feels like it. But if you just take this one as the only one, you might miss the most important bits. And another example, just experiences, but within master or even doctoral, education, when you look at shows in fine art, this is where I know more. Very often interim presentations are more exciting than final presentations. So there's a strange thing happening between the interim and the final one. What's supposed to be the result is often frightened. It often doesn't deliver, whilst the interim result, that is not a result, and because it's not a result, actually excites. So there's a strange relationship happening also about how difficult it is to actually relate to the quality, even if you practice and in a way test it, so you should be able to keep the value of the interim result, so to speak, in the final result. But for some reason that seems to disappear all the time. So the result precisely breaks what it should be, right? So it's a strange kind of dialectics there, which I've always wondered about, whether expectations and in a way objectivizations that we think about this, actually make it harder, not easier. So there's a lot of dynamics there, I would say. But if your expectation that your result has to be a knowledge contribution, right, in that way, and if you say that it has to be written up in a particular way, of course you need time to do that. So clearly then you set yourself up that it's going to be in the later stages, right? But that is not everybody thinks about it like this, And as I suggested, maybe the editing and the polishing of a text also takes away something of that in terms of its potential strengths. But I don't want to say no. I just want to say there are different possible departures in addition to that final departure. And all I want to say is that they're not being utilized often in the same way as the final one is. And I just want to say that you might be missing out on the productive dynamics if you start having earlier results. that feed into the next result and the next right, and so things become kind of collectively improved through experiences of making it, of digesting feedback or responses in some ways that if you don't have this, you might have a result, but it's never been tested really. It's never been refined. It's not enough contested, and you weren't given opportunities maybe by friends and peers to double check whether that actually makes any sense. But you've got your thing that you invested years in. So it would be clever to have earlier results, right?
Thank you for your answer.
Firstly, thank you for your oral presentation, and thank you for organizing it. And I heard quite a lot of kind of interesting thoughts about information and how it's interconnected and how it mediates to us actually in different forms and lots of things to think of. It's kind of new in doctorate, so for me it's like quite explosive thoughts in my head. But one thing what I grasped and I wanted to question you is about this idea that actually publishing is just the beginning. I love the phrase of yours that artistic performance was left only with the booklet in the end. Everyone refers to it because nothing else remains. I come from a theater field, and we have interesting kind of relationship with the booklet we have with performances, and I have quite a lot of things now to rethink about it. But I still think about this publishing question is the audience, to whom I'm publishing. I mean, who will be reading it? Who will be? For me, it's the most important thing. And since I'm starting my own research, I'm trying to grasp the form and design, how to actually redesign my own thinking, and how to put it and articulate a very nice word for that is, how to connect these two. But it seems that I'm not so sure about it. I understand my head, my studio there. I don't know the second studio I'm articulating to. So how to, maybe you have some thoughts, how to work towards articulation until you don't know who you're articulating it.
It relates a little bit of the first part of the answer to what we just said. I just want to be careful not to say I'm articulating, but it articulates. This kind of subject expressing itself, is problematic in this context. And that's why these intermediate, moments of testing and finding articulation, rather than articulating, for me is important. And that dovetails into, your specific context. Rather than thinking, artistic research or academia is just one thing and there's another big thing, there's actually a lot of different venues and different places. So part of the job, I would say, is to actually experience these differences and see in what contexts, what might articulate how, instead of having, I have something, and then would be communication the better word. I'm just pushing this out into, and that is really a question which can't be answered in general. But I would say that the specific others in which you give your work into, they will be able to value things that other contexts might not. So we talked over lunch briefly about some settings where if you've got, enemies of artistic research because they're coming from a hard science debate, nothing's going to articulate because they're just going to cut it off straight away. It will not reverberate in any form in their lives. There's nothing they recognize, right? So that environment could be a great challenge to try to do it, but the frustrations are guaranteed, I say. So whilst I feel we might be dreaming of having good arguments for the critics, fundamentally it's a very hard context. So there's also a question of, what are the contexts suitable to your project specifically, and also, and I mentioned this also professionally, right? What do you think is your future professionally? Because that makes a big difference as you're going through these stages. I mean, if you want to see yourself outside of the academy, inside of the academy, if you are moving into theory, or if you're going to be in the studio or practice part, those experiences with these results, they kind of over time produce a bit of a trajectory, So in this area, you might feel confident, and people kind of can also relate to the confidence you have accumulated, right? In other areas, maybe not so much. But it is multifaceted, and I think it's important to experience these differences and to find out where you get something back, And that's why, again, it's good to start early, and also how you can see what you're doing differently through that lens. So what you're getting back is an understanding that this context affords that a different context might not, and that is enriching for the project, I would say. Because I mean, if it's kind of open in the way I was trying to describe it, that each presentation is also an experiment, and each experience that comes with that is also a learning and an understanding and the re-understanding of the materials with which you operate. I've given similar lectures in different ways, but never the same. And every time I try to anticipate something, but whether or not this works and how this works, but something in my mind between all this tells me that's so it's a constant process, right? And over time, I've got a few things I trust I can build on, right, and others I don't. It's the way. Huh? But the point is, and this is maybe, again a bit of a relation to the other thing, is like there are crossroads where there's a harder and an easier way as well. And I think, somehow to insist on what you may call artistic qualities, right? In some contexts, they're just harder to maintain, but important to maintain despite them failing, right? So there's a resistance. So if you can say, right, in this context, this can be articulated, right? They understand this, but something very valuable, important to you, might disappear because it doesn't work here, right? Say, whatever. What I mentioned earlier, musicology and certain music kind of performance things might just never really get together the same way. So would you therefore keep it out, or would you make a point and saying, I want to make this point despite it not working, that it has to be said that there's a value and I stand for this, right? As a way of telling somebody, at least if you don't engage, you will not know, right? I'm finding, because in some contexts, many artists are just a bit timid to insist, on what they require the others to do in order to productively relate, right? Audiences have to move as well.
I've got a very simple and practical question. In the framework of doctoral studies, is pretty much clear what you are expected to do. There is the artistic part, which is accompanied by the written order. Let's call it like that. But what happens afterwards? if we want to provide the artists, researchers with a proper platform for the development of their artistic research. And it refers to the first chapter of your presentation, titled The Text. And again, I come to the differences between different fields. For the visual artist, if we have the material space of the exhibition, we can bring the text on the wall, or just to give a piece of paper, kind of catalog or something. And for the performing artist, if the outcome is a performance, what to do with this? How to deliver the totality of the outcomes? How to transmit this new knowledge? If the performance itself is not enough, should we just print something on the sheets of paper and give to the members of audience entering the performance space? It's a very practical.
Yeah, but you know, whilst as a visual artist you can hang this A4 sheet of paper there, it does not work. I mean, the fact is that you can hang in certain conceptual art circumstances, maybe. I mean, there's fringes where it might work, but by and large, it's what I refer to with Bishop as noise that is not productive. It's not seen to. So in a way, even if you say I can hang this text somewhere, it's not operational, right? So my question is, how would it become operational and relevant, other than just being a handout that I throw away? And the question is, as I was trying to say, what is the text here? If we have a simplistic understanding of text as words on a sheet of paper, it's hard to have this sheet of paper on a stage, say, right? But if text is something else, if it can be manifested in different ways, right? Then my question would be, what is the most productive way of a text being manifested in a particular event setting? And in this case, when I played the Straub-Huillet film and Gasquet's text was read by or spoken by a very specific voice, right? It became a different text and a much more resonant text. And right, I can read this, or I can buy this book with this text, I can read it, but it's going to be a different text. The question is, do I win or lose something if I do it the one or the other way, and what choice would I take? So that would be my approach. And as we've seen with the Kentridge one, if you think you need that text as a printed text, you can also print that text in a book and publish it. Using it in the one way doesn't exclude the other one if you think you need a book and a text format. So say you have a performance where the text is subtext, and then you're making a book where the text is, printed text, right? It's enriching, through these transmedial kind of effects, because this distributed object, what I'm talking about, it's enriching it rather than impoverishing it, but you cannot say that I demand every instance to deliver everything, right? What I would say is being specific to these individual events and connecting them up sensibly in such a way that across this space, the specific depths or values of the projects come to the fore. Over lunch, we talked about the UK model of the other output format, where I think it's overall quite understood and acknowledged, that more complex format, not a single format, doesn't capture it all, right? There's a need for some portfolio-ish or distributed kind of way, where, in most cases, written text has a part to play, but it doesn't need to be shoehorned into every situation because I need research to be on a paper in that setting. I would say, but it has to be tangible as text. That's what I would say. So in this film example, I think it is tangible as text, but it's not text on a paper. So I'm finding that quite important. And in theatre, I mean, again, it's not my field, but there's so many examples of text cutting into. Think of Brecht from the top of my head, I mean, there's so much text cutting into performance spaces where there's no doubt that this is text. For me anyway, it's made to become text through the cuts that it produces within the play, say. So it's not my field, but just to say that you can make it more or less legible within the art forms, when you're moving into these areas. These are things that are, to my surprise, it's just hard to really see properly acknowledged in research. There's no real theory about artistic research forms, or text in that sense. Or I don't quite know why that is, but it's a much slower process than I might have imagined over the years. But I would rely on the fact that people understand this, that they see those intermedial shifts, and when it's a text genre, and activated in various ways, and fundamentally, really, text on paper does often not function as text very well in art contexts. It's so simplistic and so it's superficial often. It's just like we have to do something to stick it there, but it doesn't really. What maybe happens is concepts. So scaffolding concepts. That's maybe something. Injecting certain words that are a bit like attractors. That seems to be an interesting area. So where it's like a label, that seems to be quite productive. Artworks you look at, you don't think, I don't know what to make, and then there's the label, and now just a little, like a little word, just to say that's the angle, that's how to cut it, right? Maybe that could be an interesting way. Like how would you do something similar in a theater context, say? Again, it's interruption. I think it's a as I tried to say, it's distributive. It comes in a relation of label to visual work, say, so it's not like it does it by itself, but that relation offers a blueprint for further relations to be made with that, right? So that relationality across media seems to be what must be activated. Don't know. Does it make sense? Thanks for nodding, but I just tell. It's like I can tell you. It's so specific. I mean, when we get submissions, you cannot anticipate when it works or doesn't. It's just very odd, but it's rewarding when it does work. I mean, that's kind of the weird thing. It really, I feel, and that's something I would maybe. It's a fundamental thing. I've wrote about editorials as well. You don't get to this point through criticism. I fundamentally believe that criticism is the wrong avenue to this point. So we get a submission, say, right? Or say you're doing your doctorate, and you get like all these people. I mean, a crit in fine art. I don't know, do you have crits in performing arts? In fine art, a crit, like you kind of have a showy thing, and then the people cluster around you and give you stick, a crit. So a critical framework to kind of probe or test or whatever it is that you do. And then what happens often is you get questions or references. Have you seen this artist's work? And what about this philosophy? And all that things around it, right? And sometimes, or very often, it challenges, without actually establishing a common ground in that moment of encounter. Reviewers tend to also be critical, and I mean rightly so. It's nothing wrong per se with it, but I would say that we can beat anything up. I mean, anything can be taken apart. In particular in these complex situations. I mean, there's so many things we don't know, so many references and relevances that could be taken with the work, and I didn't choose to take. But that reviewer might be from this field. Is why did you not talk about Deleuze here? I could have talked about that kind of thing. What's the point of criticism at this moment if nothing else is there, right? And the alternative avenue I would propose is affirmation. Like, can I find a point of affirmation in this presentation? What can I affirm here? And in a way, this is like where it starts to become engaging. That affirmation also affirms yourself as a reader at this moment, but also the work. And then from that point, you can see what elements are actually holding affirmation back. Like, for example, you might say, I need a label because I get that effect, right? But I feel confused, right? But if there's this one word, maybe it starts opening up. So that in our review and revision and production process, we're trying to push, to kind of get it to cohere around these points of affirmation discovered in that process. So criticality or criticism, in a way, comes in as helping to kind of double check, but you have to do it on the basis of this affirmation, this moment of it articulates. And what can you do to strengthen that, right? And that's a different question to, how good is it, or does it do all this kind of stuff? And that is really specific. I mean, from what angle, and sometimes it takes a lot of work, so I mean, I can spend hours reading something and thinking, God, how can I do justice to this? I've got no idea what to do. And then we have discussions in the board and all this about, because it's really hard. But even if things fail sometimes to kind of get somewhere, there's so much learned along this way. So result in that sense, may be productive and informative without actually becoming a result, simply by failing, so to speak, to fully work. It still works. We didn't have a category for potential in the peer review form that we have, so at the beginning, but very, very quickly we added this category for potential because reviewers would say, I love this project, but why didn't they do this and this and this? They're not delivering the potential that we see. The promise and the realized potential, are falling apart very, very often within. And so we have a category now for the potentials people see and whether the potentials they feel are met in a submission. And so this kind of what's in the way of realizing these potentials, right? What do you see as holding you back? And it can be sometimes academic side, it can be sometimes artistic conventions, or certain assumptions or whatever that just unbalance, what we're dealing with. So often, for example, revisions might produce more contextual material, but then suddenly you feel, it actually becomes, whatever, critical writing, it kind of, we have one example that's quite a few years in the past where a reviewer, we published this also in somewhere, says, whilst I reviewed this, and recommended contextual supplements, having seen the published version that added the contextual supplements to the submission, this was about Merleau-Ponty, I think, at the time. Nothing was gained having another half a paragraph or paragraph on Merleau-Ponty because it's not a philosophy thing, right? But the art suffered because we now having a bit too much of a philosophical sounding argument that never will convince a philosopher that this is philosophy, right? But they were forced to put it in because of the review process, the way it worked. But the reviewers felt sad about it because actually it was pointless. It was pointless to say I need another reference for Merleau-Ponty here, whilst knowing that properly developing it in that space will never work anyway, right? So what's the point of doing that, right? What's the point of Merleau-Ponty in these cases? Whatever. They're very often distractions, but they're required because people think without that contextualization, you would not be given the credibility that otherwise you need. And very often the works are not, the philosophical references for my liking, they are not worked on hard enough. There's a lot of simplistic things happening. I'd rather not have them personally. I don't need them, it's a lot of, but it comes from a certain way of engaging art in education, right? That's the avenue we've learned, instead of looking at different ways. But when it works really well. We have to say that in some submissions, in some people, it's super productive. So it's not like never do it, but does it strengthen what you do, or it's a distraction because you feel you have to do it, right? Because I don't need references in a publication. Don't see why. It's good to have them if you need them, but there's no. I'm monologuing all the time. I'm very sorry. It's an illness.
But these questions are crucial, I believe. Sorry for being so stubborn on that, but I'm just constantly thinking about this. That's why I'm asking. I do not suggest to treat the text primitively or such a straightforward way, but I'm just thinking about possible formats of, let's say, performance that would be able delivering all the context, and of how using performative means to reveal all the contexts that are relevant in that research. It would be a nice challenge to embody the relations with Merleau-Ponty.
But doesn't this happen all the time? Outside of what I'm speaking about, I think it's that's what people do, right? It's just that it may not always be recognized as text or as such, but I see masses of connections that are being made all the time in various ways, and readings.
But in that case, the audience should be very competent and being able to comprehend all these, illusions and connections and links.
And you don't think they are?
Otherwise it does not work.
You don't think they are? Well,
they should be able to grasp.
This is kind of what's related to the question from earlier, that formally the same operations in a not research context, seem to be working quite well on a cultural level. People are very able to read references in a pop video or whatever it is you pick. It's not so difficult to see how music keeps quoting itself and visual arts. I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert, but it looks to me pretty clear how the kind of digestion of the last fashion in music kind of feed to the next one or whatever on a popular culture kind of side, right? The question is how that becomes knowledge relevant in an academic context, and that's a different one. But the mechanisms of dynamics of making and of kind of relations to previous forms and images and whatever we have, are very deeply ingrained in any cultural production. But when does it really make a difference? And we had, in a way, avant-gardist phases, where you had to make a difference historically, otherwise it was not valuable. Right? We're not at this moment anymore, so we're not expecting historical change coming from any activity. There's no sense of this kind of historical agency at the moment. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but Peter Osborne, for example, complains about this in his kind of reading of contemporaneity. That this historical agency is only a fiction in contemporary art. There's no real historical agency anymore in contemporaneity, in his opinion. And that's part of the problem we have, that we don't have the kind of best practice or in a way things that stand for a larger historical situation. It's all these things at the same time changing culture without having this kind of almost symbolic, historical symbolic kind of role. And whether we can think that's a good thing, that actually it operates like this, or whether we think, no, we're missing something here. We need to find, as a community, a way of kind of radical formal changes. I mean, structural changes to society or formal changes to art making. I've got no idea what the answer is, but the conditions aren't such that these more extreme breaks, epistemic breaks, would be easy to do or even understandable, even if you did it, because I'm digressing, but just to say, it's a harder case to make in this specific political epistemic context, but formally it happens all the time. This kind of text production in media sense, I think it's a general phenomenon. So
I don't know if I can articulate this. I'll try, but it's related with what Ramona asked also. I'm from performing arts field, and every time I see presentations or examples of articles, I see many examples of visual artists, and as a performing artist and researcher, I usually am very jealous, because it seems like when you have visual information, like sculptures or pictures, you can show and represent some ideas of your work, and our work is usually experiential, like immersive. So it's really difficult to think how to articulate breaking the linear text and how to give examples, because usually our art form is now and here, like in space and time, and every time I'll try to cut a video example of film performance, it looks like a bit nonsense, like a chronicle. So chronics. And do you have any advices or examples as a JAR editor how performing arts could be articulated in publications, and what kind of forms it could get despite the linear text? Or lecture performance.
By the way, there is the thesis on lecture performance. I would be able to share.
Yeah, would be good. Well, there's just a certain premise which I find hard to share. So if I'm a painter, say, right, I'll always be struggling with the color, that's a reproduction, right? The pigments are just so different, you can never see what I see, right? If I'm a photographer, I've got the similar problem, and scale is a big issue of scale. I mean, how is that, nobody will be happy, with the material media. If you're not happen to be in this narrow kind of internet media, whatever thing, nobody will be happy. Everybody will say, it's not it, right? So I don't think there's a specific, kind of immersive situation for specific people that kind of makes it harder or less hard. It's just that we just feel these differences, but actually the kind of work that's necessary to engage, for me, is across the board really hard and difficult to do. So one thing is, I'm surprised how few people do this kind of work. So if the assumption is, like I'm saying, right, this immediacy, this immersive immediacy that you're describing is an extreme case, or maybe an illusion even, on which we're building a house, right? But everything on this side, is actually somewhere different with the reference to this, right? But not necessarily, it's never it in its pure form, right? And my question is, why not remake, or in a way, I use the word transpose. I mean, it doesn't really matter what we use here, but in a way, make something of that immanence that you're relating to in this performance situation survive those media changes. Are we saying that it can never go from here to there? It has to be staying here, right? It's so exquisite. It's so special. You miss it, right? Is that the position? And if that's the position, I cannot say anything to it because you will miss it, right? I mean, there's nothing I can say. Other than it is not, or it's very difficultly, discursively or intersubjectively available because it's so specific that it might just be in you. Because when would I know somebody else is immersed in what, right? It becomes, to me, an idealization of sort that I just find difficult to share, but I accept the position, But for most parts, there's an area that I refer to as hybrid, or some form of ability to create meaningful relationships, but that is in a different form. So saying I want to have this relationship in that form that is here, it's repeating this. And I will just advocate that it's work to write it up, to move from this immersive form into a textbook form, right? It's hard. To move from this position in a video form, it's hard, right? And I just think the qualities are sometimes not there. So when you say, I see these videos and I find it, I would say, this is not by principle, it's the stuff isn't that good maybe that you're seeing. Do one where you think, I actually got to the point of this immersive performance situation. What were the means that I needed to achieve the vision I have that makes me, on the negative side, bored by all the examples I see? And I would just feel we need people who say, I take this job on, I take on to be able to create a simulacrum, for lack of better words, or some form of survival guide of the immersive situation under others, or whatever, under difficult circumstances, or maybe under threat, even. I mean, even that is helpful. The kind of pointing to the loss could be a function. I mean, all sorts of ways possible to say there's an important point of reference, that needs to be in this space when it's a video, or that needs to be in this text if it's written. So for me, and this is a fundamentally artistic question. It's not a scholarly or whatever. It's like, and when I talked about choreography earlier, this is what people take on. They say, I want to see choreography in a text I'm writing. I want to see choreography in whatever I'm doing. And I would say this, in the same way. what do you have to do under this setting to create or to make accessible, or at least offer immersive alternatives to what you value in other circumstances. But the fundamental point is this. I mean, if the claim is it cannot be made in any other way, it's also okay, because I do not think everything needs to translate. So if I had, say, doctoral project or whatever, and this is the position, right, and I'm doing this performance, and I say it will not be in this body of work I'm submitting, right? Why not? I mean, I wouldn't argue, that any of these different instances could fully replace all the other ones. That's why it is to be multiple. That's why these things are there, right? So they are not replaced, but they're enriched by the different instances. And one instance is the physical performance that you're making, and that reverberates and it becomes memory of all the other forms in some ways, right? But that place of it, is important, but it's an empty place, so to speak, in the other formats. But without it, and it has to inform in different ways what happens. So that fabric becomes really, really central. But I would not say, if it doesn't survive, that that's principally a problem. It's just, if we don't try to relate to it and just say it's been there and the rest cannot do it, nothing, then it's a problem, because we break the fabric of those relationships.
Thank you for your answer. Colleagues?
I'm a bit afraid to ask, because I was I was late and haven't heard the very beginning of your lecture performance. Compliment. And thank you for everything. We are learning to be polite here. Thank you for organizing.
Well done.
I wonder, I know that there are academies, universities who do not ask the doctoral artistic researchers of doctoral studies to write anything. But the piece of art in some medium becomes like an expression itself. Have you seen a lot of examples?
Well, this is it's an interesting question, which so I know it's not required in some cases, but it's rarely done, if not done, because I have not really come across the concrete examples. Every time institutions will allow it, I don't really see people fully doing it. And I mentioned this briefly in the when you have a coffee. I think it's about risk management fundamentally. If I was to do a doctoral degree and I would basically put everything on this ticket, they say I'm doing this without any of this text and all the stuff, right? And I'm going to enter this exam situation, and I'm going to, because it's a yes or no thing. I mean, there's nothing to negotiate. This piece works, it's accepted or not. It's not like, it's on footnotes somewhere and you can fix it. How do you fix that, right? So it's a big thing, right? And I'm not saying it's the same, because it wasn't the same, but this big scandal in Sweden that happened where because Sweden takes, in a way, artistic research as a mid-career artist development thing a bit, so you come in as a professional artist and you in a way would not only be failed in terms of research, but you also invalidated as an artist to some degree if you failed in your research degree. Right? And this person was failed. And I mean, I don't know all the details, but I was contacted by a newspaper or whatever from Sweden, just as an interview kind of thing, because it was such a local kind of scandal in a way. And of course they were using this to challenge artistic research as how can you fail. But the point is, would you advise yourself to go into this situation, and putting 4 years of whatever on this ticket, right? So a doctoral student I had, we kind of said, if there's an introduction and some form of apparatus available, you demonstrate to the examiners, that yes, you can do this, but it's not where it happens. Here's the kind of this was speculative philosophy letter thing they did, right? It was a kind of a theory doctorate with in a kind of creative written form, but the framing of that was crucial to secure its passage, right? And it was a difficult exam in this case, so it didn't go down that well. But without that, it would have been too risky. So even if we could do it, it's a tough one. I mean, and it's also tough because you would pretend that some of the references or relations and some ways of working, for example, reading Deleuze, need to be left out in particular ways, right? So you also put yourself into maybe a more pure position than you actually are in as a maker. So it's also maybe the case that, and that's what we say in JAR as well, we don't need text to be submitted. It could be 0 words and we process it, right? It's not needed, but everybody does it. It's like crazy. I never had a submission that is a single video. I don't know why. We don't say it has to be text, but people don't do it. Don't ask me why. For those reasons, I guess, but I don't know. But it's just very, very odd. But maybe the reality is people are working hybrid. People are doing all of this, and why should they suddenly create this artifice of a purity that suddenly I'm not allowed to reference academically in this space? So maybe it's an impossible and unreal object that one might be projecting as a pure form out of this. I'd like to see it, and I'd like to see how this works. I still think we need to work towards this, but I think it's hard, and it's risky, and it is maybe more a speculation of a possibility than actually, real life. I don't know how to say this, like as if we just say, I cut out a whole half of my brain just to do this, I mean, why would I,
But then, doesn't this situation apply working in creating, researching in the transdisciplinary settings? Because, for instance, the opera singer, if we just take her pure art, so how could we find forms only in the framework of her discipline? If I don't know.
It's true. But I mean, we have to see that discipline is a historical formation. So disciplines aren't God-given, right? And they've got a certain historical dimension to it. To start with, for certain uses. So the way music has been disciplined through notation and through whatever structures over a few hundred of years has led to, and yesterday we talked about beer and hops, is also disciplining of beer. I didn't know that beer could be made without hops, but there's a lot of breweries in here that seem to be using heather. But, there's always the point that certain structures, take over and they become a pure form, like, beer and hops, or maybe opera singing, or maybe whatever, are these historical forms that we relate to as some form of pure thing. It's just that, they're historical forms. And my question is really whether, for research, actually any pure context like this exists. So if I'm a natural scientist, right? my main work will be maybe in a lab, right? I'm gonna take notes and I'm gonna measure whatever stuff, gonna have tables and books, whatever. I have to write this text, I'm not a writer, I'm a scientist. I have to do this kind of text stuff. Like, why would I suggest that this is not transdisciplinary, right? Because we think for them writing a text is natural to science, but if you are a material scientist, right, an experimental scientist, or Charles Darwin traveling somewhere, writing has not had that role as a natural part of a discipline, other than in a particular historical formation or for a particular time. But I think it's just, and it's part of the productivity of science that they are working transdisciplinarily, because they're able to, in a way, transform material knowledges into discourse that become applicable in different contexts, right? That is a highly performative, transformative labor that they're doing, right? But we don't do this, right? Because we have to be, we stay in the lab. We don't go out of the lab. We don't write it up. We don't engage with something that somebody else can do in different ways. So that's what I'm saying. There can be an idealization around this, which, whilst ideologically I sign up to it, I'm not sure if it's, and in terms of resource in particular, I really sign up for it. The resource relationship is massively important as far as I'm concerned, but whether that is the side of its, in a way, kind of cultural relevance, is a different thing. I think if you can't connect it up in any way, right? It's, yeah. I don't know. At least if you talk about epistemology, it's hard to think what epistemological frame you have for a highly separated kind of knowledge body, that is not integratable in intersubjective acceptable knowledge forms. Again, I would love to do this. I think it's hard. So already, we left kind of philosophical epistemology behind somewhere. There's historical epistemology within the history and theory of science, but it still has a sense of unity of knowledge, underwriting it. If you, and I would love to, radically break it apart, how would that be in epistemology? In what logos would those radically separate experiential and epistemic worlds speak to each other? How, but this is the point, where I feel the experience, the training, the resourcefulness, the resource that this is, it will make a big difference to what happens next, right? But whether I can expect this to do all the labor by itself without what happens next is a different question. But if we were to say, and because it needs to be hybrid, I can take away the opera singer, it's enough to just be, that I wouldn't do, right? Because the specific way this person would be working through musical material, body, whatever context you're dealing with, in order to reimagine what an aria might be like or whatever, is you cannot do it in another way, I don't think. But this is kind of what we all should be discussing. I have no answer. It's just like we don't know. We just don't know. And I don't know if people are pushing boundaries enough. If they think that's valuable boundary to push, I would know. It's exciting. I find a lot of these things, for these reasons, exciting. Not so much. It depends. That's a different story, but just to say, let's assume, I mean, would you like to hear a speculation?
We love speculation.
Let's assume it works like this, right? I mean, in my mind, I'm working on this kind of theory of polylocality, which is like, anyway, for the future. But let's assume it's the case. Let's assume that this singularity around a particular performer, body, whatever, is such that it does not dovetail into anything else, but it's unique. It's singular, right? So the topology, in the way all this material is organized, has a specific signature that is not translatable into another kind of one. So you've got, and I think that's the case. So fundamentally, I would argue, yes, it's the case. But without relating to that, right, I would have no idea what this is. I mean, I wouldn't even know there's somebody else because how do I identify the thing that I can't relate to within my, right? So imagine you've got this, right? So it's this kind of singular thing, and I'm a single thing. And now, we meet, or in my words, we consult, right? So you kind of have this moment of encounter between two incompatible units, What happens if it articulates, right? My point would be that actually a new trajectory emerges that is neither already inside my world, because otherwise I would have a relationship already to the other world, which I don't, nor in the singer's world, because again, we define it to be radical separate. But when it articulates, it seems to create potentials that neither has realized. And it's not dialectic in a sense of this like a unifying thing, it's actually an event structure, right? And for me, this is kind of how I explain myself what happens at these moments, that when this encounter takes place, new possibilities, generally new possibilities, kind of a new spatio-temporal structure emerges. A new form of understanding comes out of this, that becomes a relational object between these things. And that's how I would look at this, that without it, it is simply a free-floating radical that has it doesn't articulate, right? So what kind of example would it be, if I couldn't name it in any way, if I wouldn't see it in any way because I've got no relation to it? So when you say it's this singer, you already have articulated something, right? So it's already put into these relationships. So it's just that, are we happy with this word? So it's a singer, opera singer. Are we happy with what this shorthand is supposed to do? Like, is it doing justice to the person that we label like this, as an example, right? So how is the feedback, so to speak, to a particular pigeonholing of a certain person in a certain role? Right? There are all sorts of problems around this. So I would think that whenever we enter these examples into discourse, we are already operating in articulation space. And then my question would be, when and how are these articulations become productive? So is this example productive, and why? If it's a challenge, so to speak, just to test sophistically kind of a theory, then it has a certain purpose. If it's about, what this person has been able to do through a particular embodied material performative engagement with, say, composition, we would have a different situation we would have to relate to, and then I might experience a strangeness I cannot reconcile in myself, but I can accept it to be not me, but still beautiful or still relevant, right? I don't need to become, it's complex, but just to say, there would be a space, an epistemological space that would not be pre-given. It would always be emerging between particulars and not as a unifying space. And last speculation, we'll solve for this. this is Europe's problem. So Europe, in a way, as regions or as nations or as cultures, right? When we suggest it to be a unified space, the regions struggle. The unified space doesn't work on this level. If the regions are articulating and consulting each other through various programs that Europe also has, it's a working model. But that unified space within which they should operate, nobody finds themselves in that space. So Europe has these different layers of in a way, knowledge spaces. On the one hand, it accepts radically separate cultural knowledges and invites them and wants to strengthen them. On the other side, it unifies them, and between that, we keep operating, right? Because there is no model yet, I think, politically speaking, for non-unified solidaric or consultory processes within distributive knowledge networks. Anyway, sorry for it's a bit of a hobby I have at the moment. I mean, this is also where artistic research becomes informative, on all sorts of levels, because we are doing this already with the media materials that we are thinking, how may radically heterogeneous spaces cohabit non-shared spaces. I mean, not shared in the sense of not already shared spaces. How do we make a shared space without losing integrity of the ones that are sharing? Right? And that would be the same between a performance and the text. They want to come together as what they are, and you don't want to shortchange any of that, and you want the effect between the two to become something momentous, right? That's what you want.
I don't know how about you, but my brain is boiling. So
yeah.
The very last question. Yes.
I don't know, maybe it could sound a little bit stupid as my English is not very good, so I'm sorry about that. You said previously that there's no very strict rules about artistic researchers, so how can you know which works you will publish or not publish in
Yeah.
Good question. It could be, literally anything. Research on opera or fashion or something else. So I'm just curious.
No, absolutely. I mean, you may remember this diagram I had where this cloud kind of thing, and then the arrows kind of turn inside at the outside. So I mean, really the fundamental concept is exposing practice or artistic practice as research, but you can also say exposing practice as art. I mean, in a different context, right? In the academic research context, it's like this. So in a way, if it is as specific as I say it is, right, it would establish what it is through its articulation. So, and I think that's very true. If you're looking at the history of science, where certain phenomena were being studied, and they're not necessarily already science. They've been harvested, like traces of events are harvested to become scientific knowledge. They could be harvested to become artistic knowledge. So in a way, the cloud kind of is not automatically the one or the other. But methods, approaches, and maybe resources that we talked about, are such that artists are bringing in elements that otherwise are not being brought in, that make whatever comes out of this as artistic. It needn't mean artwork in any way. The starting point needn't be artwork. It's a mode of working, which I think, and it allows us to see something we did not see previously with the conceptions we had, the presuppositions we had, as artistic suddenly becomes artistic. Well, that's what art can do, right? Suddenly this becomes artistic. Now, personally, I'm not really sure if that holds. So there was a moment where I proposed and we discussed and we kind of didn't call the Journal for Artistic Research the Journal for Research, because fundamentally I think it's the same anywhere. So it could be like this. And if you're looking at, Hans-Jörg Reinberger, I've done a lot of writing and discussion with this historian of science. Also he and others make a strict separation between research, which is underdetermined. So I mean, research must be underdetermined. So it has not yet become science or knowledge, right? And science being overdetermined, really. So there's a space of lack of determination, that I think artists, I mean, anybody exploits, but artists exploit in particular ways. And I would like to see, the specific kind of historical figure of art to be used for this. Whilst I acknowledge that, say, art historical work can be creative. So, say, Didi Huberman's work on Fra Angelico, I think he's an art historian, but it's actually very artistic. So, I mean, I would publish this personally, but I don't think a lot of people would say it's, artistic research in that more narrow sense. But we're balancing on this line where you see from reviewers, so the peers, and the editorial board, the peers, you see what the field can digest at any moment as we develop. At this stage, we can digest some things, and we've published stuff that is at borders of artistic, I would say, within what that group feels comfortable in, right? It's an ongoing debate. It's a very hard thing to, and I don't know. I don't know. I'd like to know. I mean, I really don't know how to say this. So say the situation was that maybe in the 18th, 19th century, kind of knowledge systems have bifurcated in this way, where the positive is the science and the negative, is the arts in a way, negative knowledge, so to speak, sublime, or whatever we take out of this, But what we're seeing is a different convergence now, and my question is, whether what we culturally will achieve will actually be, a radicalization of all possibilities, including the situated, embodied, and aesthetic capacities that need to be included, and scientific, conceptual, and technological capacities. So it would be everything, right? So that space would be only, somewhere, that one space where we don't have to separate anymore, where we use everything we can to understand that phenomenon, right? I don't care if it's scientific, I don't care if it's artistic, but it has to not exclude any possible faculty I have to make sense of this. I mean, that would be the ideal. Until we're there, we have to say we are there to make sure artistic sensibility is included in knowledge making, and yes, we are paying for it by excluding purely scientific processes, because we have to protect artists until we are there from the kind of exclusion from knowledge, institutions. But I don't think it's the goal, But as long as artistic knowledge is excluded structurally within cultural and political decision-making processes, we must have a space where we protect and foster, those modes of knowledge. So it's a strategic, necessary step, but I don't think it's an epistemologically tenable separation, really, at the end.
So I believe it's a really nice conclusion, and while celebrating this diversity of approaches, maybe we should make sure that we deal with real articulation in Michael's terms, or is it something different? So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
And, I believe we got
much of inspiration and much of material for recycling and digesting and recycling. And see you in other contexts. Thank you so much.
Thank you.